Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're doing part one of a two-part series on bail reform. Bail reform is a big part of criminal justice reform. We have lots of people who are unable to make bail. The cost is too high, they can't afford it, and when you can't afford bail, guess what? You stay in jail until the time of trial. So this is something that clearly affects people of color, people of lower economic means, more so than people of more means financially. And this is a big problem in our criminal justice system. So we have two-part episodes this week and next week. Today's episode features somebody who believes bail reform is not appropriate. He is an attorney from Texas who represents the bail insurance industry. Next week, we'll have somebody from the other perspective who represents the viewpoint that we do need significant bail reform to address the inequalities, the structural inequalities in our system. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. It is a bit of a rousing conversation as I take on someone who feels that the left is pushing this issue to create chaos in our criminal justice system, believes ultimately this will result in more people being released from detention, from jail or prison, and that this will increase crime in our country. We take that on, and a wide-ranging debate on criminal justice reform as well. We even get into the Derek Chauvin trial somewhat toward the end of our conversation. I think you'll find it both informative and interesting, rounded out by our conversation next week on this important issue on this episode and the next episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. I want to welcome my guest on today's episode, Ken Good. Ken is on the board of directors of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. Mr. Good, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Well, thank you for having me. I love the name of the show, Good Law, Bad Law. Ken Good on the show.
Thank you very much. You are the first bondsman we've had on the podcast, and that may surprise some people that we're talking to someone who has the background that you do. But the issue of bail bond is so important in any conversation about criminal justice reform, and has become an increasingly hot topic of discussion as part of criminal justice reform debate. That when I was invited to have you on the program, I readily accepted, because I know that we would all learn so much from someone with your background. So I really do appreciate you being on the program. Do us a favor, Ken, and give us a little background on yourself and the work that you do as a bondsman in Texas.
Well, I'm going to surprise you, because I'm not really a bondsman.
Oh,
I'm an attorney who represents bondsmen.
There we go.
I grew up in a really small town in Texas, around Abilene, Texas. Had two public school teachers, parents, very blue collar values. My grandfather was a sharecropper, a deacon of his church, was a very unique person who you didn't want to, he made you want to be a better person. I went to, graduated from high school, 24 people, was probably a farming town. So I was behind when I went to college, caught up, graduated in 3 years, got a master's degree, went to law school, started practicing law, started arguing cases at the appellate courts, got board certified in civil appellate law. And then someone called me and said that they were a bondsman and they had 45 default judgments, and they had asked somebody, who do you call when you have a default judgment? And they said, we need an appellate attorney, and a really good one is Ken Good. And so from that, word of mouth, I started representing bondsmen. I am Texas counsel for several insurance companies. I represent bail bondsmen across the state of Texas. I've argued the two most important cases in the bail industry in the last 10 years or 20 years at the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and the industry won both of them. I'm on the board of directors for the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. I'm on their legislative committee. We propose bills to the legislature to improve the criminal justice system. We argue for and against bills before the legislature. We're a resource to many elected officials, providing our insights on the industry. I mean, there's a reason why the bail industry has been around for over 200 years, because we do a good job, and we do a good job at getting people to court, which is, the conveyor belt that keeps the criminal justice system moving. As we found from the pandemic, if people don't come to court, the court quit doing anything. And we now have several years backlogs of cases that will have to be resolved. And now what are we doing? We're talking about limiting the use of private surety bail, which is the very thing they need to use more of to get caught up.
And I practice on the civil side, so I'm very familiar with the backlog that the pandemic has caused in the civil dockets, certainly around Pennsylvania. How there are constitutional requirements in criminal cases that aren't the same in civil cases. So, criminal cases need to proceed more expeditiously to preserve people's constitutional rights. But how does the issue of bail play into the backlog that you're referring to in the criminal dockets?
Well, before this pandemic and before, we started talking about criminal justice reform, some of the things that were driving it was just jail overcrowding. And in Texas, we have a large amount of the population that's in the jail pre-conviction. And so we see a lot of the reforms being pushed because we've got a large number of people sitting in jail pre-conviction. The problem is, there's so many misconceptions. These are really dangerous people awaiting trial. They're in jail for a reason. This is not, first-time misdemeanors that are being held in jail because they can't afford bail. I think we've proven that. I don't think there's any first-time offenders in jail that are being denied bail because they can't afford it. I think what we're seeing is like the Harris County Jail right now. The pandemic has stopped cases from being tried for a year, except for pleas, and the jail's full. The jail's full after they've tried a bunch of reforms. And as the DA testified before the legislature, it's full of very dangerous people who do not need to be out of jail. They need to be there until they're tried.
Well, but there are a lot of people who can't afford bail, whether they're first-time offenders or repeat offenders. What about those people?
Well, I think that's okay. Harris County, they were sued in federal court, and that was the big argument, that there was a lot of people in jail because they couldn't afford it. I think the expert witnesses said that the turnover rate, people who were arrested, released for the misdemeanor, was about 3% of the jail population. So I don't think we're talking about a very large group. I think it's very small. And, right now they've tried reforms in Harris County. So unless you're charged with one of 7 crimes, you never even see a magistrate. You just get released on a $100 PR bond. So, in fact, that's one of my criticisms of the Harris County system. You never see a magistrate unless you have one of the carve-out offenses that you're charged with. And no matter how many.
What are those carve-out?
The more severe misdemeanor offense, like a third-degree DWI, burglary, stuff like that. But the problem is, if you just commit a crime that's not on the 7 list carve-out, you never see a magistrate, no matter how many times you do it. So there's no gatekeeper reviewing to say, hey, this is the 10th time you've been arrested for this crime and we're not resolving your cases because of the pandemic. Maybe you need to either have a higher bond or maybe you need to set it in jail for a while, because one of the elements that you look at for setting bail is public safety. And if you've been arrested 5 or 6 times and charged with the same crime, you're not in jail because you're poor. You're in jail because you're a risk to public safety.
Well, what about drug crimes? How many? What is the percentage? What is the percentage of individuals awaiting trial, unable to make bail, who are in that position because of a drug-related crime?
Well, first of all, during the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in suicides as a result of drug overdoses. Probably, I think we're going to be shocked in a few years with how many deaths we've had during the pandemic from suicide, drug overdoses. And it's going to be shocking that they'll probably match in some areas the number of deaths from the pandemic itself. And so those are things that we have to look at. But in Texas, we have a very unique situation going on. In our largest counties, we have district attorneys who've been arrested. And so certain low-level drug crimes, they're no longer prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And that's problematic because I think we need to be evaluating that at the state legislature, not at the county by county basis. Because, if you're a defendant in one county, you might not be prosecuted. But in the very next county, they may still be prosecuting. And that, to me, seems fundamentally unfair. But we have that going on. So I think we have a large, Dallas, I think, is doing it. Harris County's been doing it, where certain low-level drug offenses are not being tried. They're just not being. Harris County, I think if you go to just a workshop and get your little certificate, they dismiss the case. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little bit critical that I'm not critical that, I think we need to have a statewide policy on what we're doing. And we need to be, if we decide as a public policy to decriminalize certain crimes, I think we're all in favor of that. Mm-hmm. But I don't like this selective enforcement different between county to county. I know why the larger counties are doing it, because they've got a severe problem. Our jail overcrowding is focused in the 12 largest counties. They're all urban areas. And, the problem we have, the real problem about bail reform, criminal justice reform, is really about how do you process large numbers of people through the jail quickly and efficiently? Because, like Harris County arrests about 50,000 misdemeanors a year. That's how many a month down to how many a week. Let's just say that's 1,000 people that have to be magistrated a week through the jail. And that's a large task. And Harris County has never individually magistrated everybody arrested. Historically, they use bail schedules. That's where they got in trouble. They got sued. They got in federal court. They didn't give an opportunity for poor people to ask for a deviation. They were told not to talk. And so they, the Fifth Circuit imposed procedures. And once those procedures were put in place, then the poor had an opportunity to ask for a deviation. And so the Fifth Circuit said, hey, okay, now you comply. It goes back to rational basis review. The problem is we have the groups our friends on the left misrepresenting the holding. They're saying, oh, well, the courts have held you can never hold a misdemeanor. No, the courts have held that the poor has a right to a hearing to ask for a deviation if you're using a bail schedule. And so we have just fundamental disagreements over even the ruling of the federal courts. And that's something that we've never really had before. We usually have been able to agree on what the law is and what the fix is. And I think the politics right now are so divisive that we can't even agree on what the law, black and white letter law, says on a case. It's really sad.
Well, tell me a little bit more about that, because everything is so highly politicized today, but probably a lot of people listening can't even imagine the issue of bail in a political sense. So when you referred a few minutes ago to what the left says, and that this is has also become a politicized issue. I mean, what are the politics of this as you see it?
Well, I think the politics start very simply. There are groups and there is a coalition, and there's not everybody in the coalition agrees, but a part of this coalition believes that we should not be punishing or holding people accountable for certain crimes. You can see it in California. If someone robs of something of less than $900 or $900 something in value, you will not be prosecuted. They made that a state law. And so, you have San Francisco closed many pharmacies because of they can't make money in that climate. So I think we just have a group that thinks that if you're poor and you commit a crime because you're poor, or if you are poor when you commit a crime, you should not be prosecuted for that. I think that goes to the punishment. I don't think that goes to whether you committed a crime. I think we have to be a country of crimes. If we're not a country of crimes, then we're not a country. But I think other than that, we have a jail overcrowding problem in our inner cities. we actually have a bigger problem than that. We have in our inner cities, families have failed. Families don't stay together. We have schools have failed. Dropout rates are incredible. Drug use is just epidemic in the inner cities. We have all these, before the riots and before all the damages from the riots, we had no job opportunities in the inner cities. It's even worse now. And so now we're coming to criminal justice reform and we're saying, hey, we shouldn't hold them accountable even there. And this is really just about, we shouldn't be holding people accountable. And, you know, I'm kind of from the standpoint of this is the last opportunity to get some of these people to become productive citizens, and we're giving up on them. I mean, the perfect example, you are a misdemeanor person in Harris County and you get you get arrested. Hey, they didn't do anything to me. I get arrested again for the same crime. I mean, ultimately you get the green light and you start thinking, you know what, I can do more. We've had over 100 people in Harris County who have been killed by individuals who were out on multiple bonds, multiple PR bonds, free bonds given to them by the court. And so now we have the public starting to perceive that the defendants have greater rights than the victims. And so we're kind of turning the system upside down. And I think part of it is we just don't know how to address crime. We don't know how to address all of our past failures as a society in these inner cities. And we don't know how to fix it. And so now we're just, you know, really, I would say we're throwing our hands up and say we should just not hold people accountable.
Well, and I want to get back to the specific application of the bail issue in the broader context that you're now talking about. But, you know, when you talk about accountability, and we've touched on a number of different issues, overcrowding in prisons, selective or different levels of prosecution of the same types of crimes, whether it's county by county or state by state. And the impact of that on society, that where certain crimes may be seen as tolerated to a certain extent because of these structural differences in different communities. But you know, so just to touch on a few of those, I mean, let's take selective enforcement of criminal laws. I mean, there are many people who have been prosecuted for drug crimes, small level drug crimes, who are sitting in jails. I know in Philadelphia that, you know, we've seen that playing out as well, as there's been a relaxing of prosecuting for lower level drug crimes, for example, because we have a tremendous problem with overcrowding in jails and prisons here, as in many parts of the country. But you know, if you zoom out even a little further to get at what you're raising here, I mean, we have people who don't pay taxes, you know, for example, and some of that's legal. You know, some people just have the ability to hire better accountants and can better legally avoid paying taxes that someone else might not. But you also have a lot of people not paying taxes unlawfully, you know, but we don't have the resources to prosecute everybody who is unlawfully avoiding paying their fair, you know, their proper and legally required share of taxes. Some people are prosecuted, many people are not. So how is that different? You know, and by the way, most of the people who aren't paying their fair share of taxes are probably white and more affluent. So you have a certain white collar crime in that example where people aren't being prosecuted, but you have drug crimes that where the perpetrators, if you will tend to be people of color, people of lower means economically. So how is that different?
Well, okay, as you said, let's pull this back to the issue of bail. What is the purpose of bail? The purpose of bail is to get someone to appear for court. So by the time we're getting involved, the decision of who to prosecute, whether to prosecute, or whether to file charges has already been made. We have nothing to do with that.
Mhm.
I mean, the only purpose of bail is to get someone to show up for court. I mean, that's what we do. That's what we do well. That's what we do better than anybody else. And if they're telling you anything different, then they're misrepresenting. That's we have half the failure to appear rate of any other vehicle. The Vera Institute was talking to some judges recently saying, oh, you should be fine with these reforms. These reforms will have a 40% failure to appear rate, but that's going to be any reform. Well, a 40% failure to appear rate when you have 1,000 people showing up for court every week is going to mean the first week you got 400 people that don't show up. The second week you've got now 1,400 people that need to show up. And so every week it exponentially gets higher and higher, and that creates a bigger and bigger backlog, which is the reason why Harris County, the misdemeanor courts, even before the pandemic, had doubled their numbers of pending cases. And you can imagine what that would be like now after the pandemic. But to answer your question specifically about selective enforcement, I mean, I think those are bigger issues than we can resolve today, because the issue of property taxes, I don't believe anyone that owes property taxes is not prosecuted civilly, because they file a lien and they start if you get to a certain point, they foreclose on the property. And so you either pay your property taxes or they take the land and then they sell it. But the other issue of, if I have an accountant and he says that I owe this amount of taxes, there's going to be people who are always going to say, I'm lying, I'm cheating, I'm not paying my fair share. Mm-hmm. But that's not an issue for the courts. That's not an issue. How can I be prosecuted? How can I be accused of a crime when I hire an accountant, he goes out and applies the tax laws and says, this is what I owe. And, someone else, maybe you, maybe someone else decides, well, that's not enough. Well, that's not a crime. That's just a disagreement. And
right. And I'm not talking about those people. I mean, somebody who's, found a loophole and it's a lawful loophole, or
it's just the way the law applies.
Yeah, or just understands how the tax laws apply better and is able to, hire a good accountant. And
I mean, let's look at the pandemic. The pandemic, we've had how many rounds of stimulus for people, and my wife also works. She's also an attorney, and we have a daughter in college, and we haven't really qualified for any stimulus funds for individuals or for families, and we didn't qualify for any financial aid for our daughter being in college. And I sure would have liked some when I was paying Baylor University a whole bunch of money, but those are bigger issues. It's kind of like the whole, where have we failed people in our urban communities? How many different ways can we fail them? But the issue that we are is, talking about is bail reform, criminal justice reform. And, we're kind of the poster child for some issues which really have nothing to do with us. All we do is get people to show up for court. Now, the question is, should they be required to get someone from the private industry to make sure they come to court, or should they be let out without having to pay for it? And, I have a disagreement about whether we take advantage of the poor, because people who can't get out of jail because they're poor, we don't make any money off of them, and we don't want them sitting in jail. Those are issues that don't involve the bail industry. The problem we have is that when we're in these large urban areas, the solutions usually make a bigger problem than they resolve. If the counties would just try to figure out, or the urban areas try to figure out, how do we identify the people who cannot afford a bond? Because we know that everybody that can, they're going to have a higher appearance rate, because the private industry does a much better job of getting people to show up for court. If we would try to set up systems that would identify them, so that we could focus on just the people who clearly cannot get out of jail and take that on by the government, we would have a much better system. But I think we have friends on the other side, part of the coalition, that wants chaos, because chaos, they can take advantage. And I think that's what we're seeing.
All right, but before I get to that, just explain how the bail system, with private insurance providing essentially the coverage for bail, works. How does that assure people show up for
well,
court?
we have two different types of counties in Texas for setting bail, but we have really just two types of groups that set bail. We have individuals, And if if you're posting a bond as an individual, you're posting it based on your personal financial statement. And so you're saying, I have these resources, and please allow me to write bail in your county, or please license me by the local bail bond board. And I'm going to put up security with the county. And so I can write based upon a ratio. So if I put up $50,000 cash, then I can write up to $500,000 in bonds that can be active at any one time. If I want more, if I want to post more bonds, I have to post more collateral with the county. Or we can have an insurance company be licensed or approved for their agent to write a bail bond. So like in Harris County, if ABC Insurance Company wanted to get an agent approved, then they would go through the same application process. They would post a $50,000 CD with the county, and they would be approved to write bonds in Harris County. They have to post a $50,000 CD for each agent that's licensed. So, insurance company, Texas is unique. The insurance companies in Texas have millions of dollars posted as collateral security in counties across the state to authorize their agents to post bonds on their behalf. And so then once they're licensed or approved, then the jail posts a list of approved bondsmen. And when someone's arrested, they'll start calling, or their family will start calling, or they'll be contacted about would they like to have a bond posted. Normally in Texas, it's a negotiated fee, but usually about 10% of the face amount of the bond. So if it's a $1,000 bond, about $100. Not all of that's paid before release. It can be a payment plan. People can be released for $30 and then a payment plan. But if it's a large bond, sometimes we want family to come in and speak on behalf that this is a good person. We'll help you make sure they show up for court. And so
let me make sure I understand this. So let's say bail is set for $100,000. That person or their family can come to an insurance company who's licensed and approved by the county,
or an individual,
and let's say post or pay to the insurance company, or be on a payment plan to pay 10% of the $100,000. And then the insurance company essentially is using that 10% as collateral on the full amount of the bill.
That's just the premium. It's just like car insurance. And it's even in the individual, it's the premium that's charged, that's paid for the posting of the bond, whether it's whether it's paid out all at one time, or there's a payment plan. So the person or the individual of the company or the agent for the company posts a $100,000 bond. It's a signature saying, this is a surety bond. I promise that this person will appear. And if they don't appear, and I don't do what I'm supposed to do by statute, then under certain circumstances, I will pay the full $100,000 to the county.
And if the person doesn't show up for court, they lose that premium. Is that right?
Well, they always lose the premium, because you don't have a right to your premium back for your car when you pay your car insurance. Now, there's collateral and there's premium. Premium is just what got you out, what got us to post the bond. And, we don't return, when you pay for the premium and your insurance on your house, you don't get that back just because you didn't have a claim. You don't get back just because you didn't show that you showed up for all your court appearances. That means you agreed, you satisfied, you met all of your promises, and we met all of our promises. We were on the bond. When somebody's released, they come into our office, they fill out their paperwork, they tell us how to contact them, and then they report to us. So depending on the risk, they either report weekly by phone. If it's a bigger risk, we may have them come to our office to come, and we tell them, we remind them of their court dates. We get them to go to their court dates. If it's a big bond and they're having problems getting to court, we may go get them and take them to their court date. And then if our family, or if their family contacts us and said, hey, little Johnny started using drugs again, and I don't want them on this bond anymore. We have, under certain circumstances, the ability to notify the court of this. So we kind of have a quasi-court relationship, and we can notify the judge when things go awry, and the court can step in and say, okay, we don't want you out on bond anymore. or we're going to give you a lecture, and then hopefully you will straighten up. And then if they fail to appear for court, then the law gives us incentives for going and finding them. So because we want to go get them, bring them back, and put their case back on track as quickly as possible. Because whenever somebody doesn't come to court, their case has to be put on hold. Because it's a criminal case, we can't just take action without them. The Constitution requires that we have to wait for them to return. And it could be hours, it could be days. If they're running, it could be years. It could be that they have to commit a new crime before they come back into the system.
So in order for a private insurance company to provide the bond, there has to be resources, either the individual or their family, to pay the premium for that bond with the insurance companies,
or at least enter into a payment plan,
or some kind of payment plan, which also I imagine would be subjected to some kind of ability to pay analysis that the insurance company engages in.
I mean, it can. It depends on the risk. I mean, if we're talking about $1,000 bond, they're paying $100. I mean, and they pay $30 down. I don't think so. But I think it's all dependent upon the risk. You know, we have all this analysis, all this debate about risk analysis. Bondsmen do a risk analysis every time they post a bond.
Right, and some of that risk analysis is directed to what is the risk of the person not showing up for court, because the insurance company is, as you explained, is promising the court that it's going to pay the whole amount if the person doesn't show up.
Well, and that's really all we do. We guarantee appearance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what we're evaluating. Are they a good risk on not appearing?
So how many people is the private bail insurance industry? I mean, is there any analysis of the economic or socioeconomic breakdown of the people that industry is serving?
No, there's not. In fact, there was a couple of years ago, the number of cases, and I just don't remember them because I probably never knew them in detail, but the private surety bail, I think another way to look at this is, you know, in Texas, the courts have delegated giving notice of court settings to the bail industry. And so when you look at it like that, you realize this is a huge undertaking. So when the counties start setting up their own departments to try to take this on for poor people, they don't realize what a big job it is. And there are things that we do that no government entity can ever do. Like, you know, we have incentives to go find people. You know, if you don't show up and you're on a PR bond, nobody's going to go look for you, because all they did was evaluate whether you're a good risk for a PR bond, reported that to the court, and the court granted you a PR bond. If you don't show up, nobody's going to call you. They're just going to issue a warrant. The warrant's going to go down to the warrant department. It's, you know, in a large county, it's going to join the tens of thousands of other warrants that are waiting to be served. And so from that perspective, you know, the case is, if they're running, the case will not get back on track quickly because there's no one looking. They're waiting for them to commit another crime so the warrant can be served on them, or they're just waiting for them to come back on their own volition. But
do you, and I know you're saying you don't really have data on the population served by this industry in terms of economic means, but I mean, obviously, if somebody doesn't have the means financially to put up the funds for the premium for essentially the down payment on the bond, they're not, those are people who are not able to take advantage of private bail insurance, right?
True. But you know, I mean, like under the federal court system, you know, from the Fifth Circuit case O'Donnell, which we have a lot of talk about, you know, procedures were set up so if you were released, you know, you got arrested in Harris County, they had a bail schedule, your bond was set at $10,000 percent to the bail schedule. If you got arrested and you said, I can't afford that, well, within 48 hours, you would have a hearing. And the judge would look at you and you would say, I can't afford $10,000. And they'd say, okay, well, let's talk. What is your situation? And if the court said, okay, I've evaluated you as an individual and I've decided to change your bond to $9,000 because of all the factors. You know, ability to pay is not the only factor. It's one of 5 factors. And so in that situation, you know, the constitutional procedural requirements have been met. You have been personally evaluated by the judge. She or he has determined your situation and determined what amount of bail should be set for your risk. And then we have other cases that say the fact that you can or cannot pay that doesn't mean that you have to have the bond changed to an amount you can afford. You've had your procedural due process requirements met. Where we have problems with our friends on the left is they say, well, bails have been held unconstitutional. Well, that's an intentional misrepresentation. What the courts have held is if you don't have procedures in place to protect the poor, then you have procedural due process problems. But at least 2 courts have held now that bail is substantively due process. So the use of bail meets constitutional requirements. It doesn't, I mean, we've had cases filed across the country trying to have bail held substantively unconstitutional, and those have all failed. No court has held that bail is substantively unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, that would undo something very fundamental to the criminal justice system if that were.
Well, I mean, you talk about chaos. I mean, we have chaos in our big urban areas now, or because they're having trouble with how do we process large numbers of people. You get rid of bail, the private industry completely, then you have nothing but chaos.
Well, if you get rid of bail entirely, you're either going to have to hold everybody or you're going to hold no one.
Well, you know, the federal system is kind of based on that, and they have a list of crimes that have a presumption of detention. And so as a result, they now detain about 70% of the people who are arrested in the federal system. We couldn't afford that in Texas. I mean, a lot of what you see now going on in Texas with criminal justice reform, and like you said, we're no longer prosecuting low-level criminals for certain drug crimes. It's not because of anything other than we don't have anywhere to put them, and we don't want to build more jails. So we're telling our public, you've got to put up with more crime, whether you want to or not, because we're not willing to house them anymore.
Well, hold on a second. I mean, let me push back on that last point. I mean, the reason we're seeing in communities across the country, and again, I'm in Philadelphia. We're seeing it here. I'm originally from California. I'm familiar a little bit with what's going on there. Part of the reason is overcrowding of jails and prisons for sure. Part of it, though, isn't it because attitudes about what is a crime, in particular in what we now call lower level drug crimes, has changed. I mean, in the last decade, many states, I think nearly half of the states in the country now have fully legalized marijuana, for example. That wasn't true 10 years ago. And it's also because we have some greater understanding of the racial disparities in the overcrowding of our jails and prisons. And that speaks to not the greater prevalence of such crimes in communities of color, but speaks more to the issue of higher rates of prosecution in communities of color. So if you have overcrowding and that's the only thing you're looking at, sure, you can see things in that way, but we have a history in this country of over prosecution of people of color, over prosecution of people of lower economic means, higher prosecution rates of lower level crimes like drug crimes, possession, small amounts of possession, for example. You people sitting in jail, serving long terms for drug crimes that by today's standards would never be prosecuted.
Well, I think there's some of this that I would agree with you, but there's other parts that I probably would not agree with you. And let me tell you, I think I agree with you that society is setting the standard on a lot of this. Mm-hmm. But the over-incarceration was set by society when we had this war on drugs. And so we had set more incarceration rates, higher punishment rates, less discretion for judges on a lot of drugs.
Uh-oh. Wait a second. Oh, now you're back. Okay, we lost you for a second.
So we decided to have a war on drugs. And I think that now we're evaluating that differently. But where I will challenge you to see if I can affect your opinion on the edges a little bit is on conviction rates. Because I would argue, or I would suggest, is our over-incarceration of certain demographics really because we have crime concentrated in urban areas? And in our urban areas, we have flight of some socioeconomic groups, leaving a concentration of other minorities in those areas where they have schools that have failed, families that have failed, opportunities failed, drug use skyrocketing. And as a result, those become concentration areas for nothing else but crime. And so I would argue that some, maybe not all, but some of the higher incarceration rates are a direct result of our higher population urban areas, especially when you look at Texas, where the overcrowded jails are in our 12 largest urban areas. That would seem to argue in support of my position. But I would say historically, I agree with you that
isn't overcrowding in urban areas because there are more people there? I mean, if you have more people,
if you've got overcrowding,
that doesn't necessarily mean the rates of crime are higher. I mean, rates could be the same, but you just have more people, and that's why we have more judges in the court here in Philadelphia than we do in neighboring Montgomery County. You just have more people here.
I don't think it's just more people. I think you have, okay, let's look at it a different way. If you have an urban area that has more crime, but the urban area is mostly one demographic, then the group that's there is committing crime on the same demographic. In Smith County, we're probably as good old boy as you get, especially when I moved here 30 years ago. But one of the first DAs that was very popular with all segments, even the Democrats, was because he prosecuted crime on a colorblind basis. He didn't care what your demographic was. If you were, in some areas of Texas and probably the Deep South, just because someone of a certain socioeconomic group or racial group was killed, maybe, well, okay, who cares? That did not happen. He became popular because he didn't care. He was colorblind on who the victim was and who the defendant was. And I think that if we look at it from that perspective, I just think that we just can't say this is all because we're just putting too many of one socioeconomic group, one racial group in jail. I think it's a bigger issue than that. It's not just that simple. I think that our large urban areas where we have so much failure and people that can afford to leave those areas have left, just like people are leaving California now and looking for other opportunities in other places. The businesses that can afford to leave are leaving.
I don't think anybody's going to say left or right that these issues are simple. But fact is, I jaywalk every day. I never worry that anything's going to happen to me. I lived in New York for years. I've lived in Philadelphia for 30 years. I don't think twice about it. But 2 Black teenagers in Kentucky jaywalked and they were taken to the ground by police. I'm not saying that defines the entire situation, but you really, I think a colorblind prosecutor like the one you're talking about in Smith County, I think historically that has to be by far and away the exception. You have 2 Black teenagers taken to the ground, handcuffed and very roughly handled for jaywalking. I'm a white male. I never worry about that. Doesn't that speak to that? And I know that's such an innocuous example in many ways. We're talking about jaywalking. We're not even talking low-level drug crime or more serious crime for sure. But you really would have to have blinders on to not see the overcrowding in prisons and jails and the disproportionate numbers of people of color in those overcrowded facilities being a product of a kind of systemic targeting of certain groups of people by the system. Whether that's people who don't have the resources economically that more affluent or privileged groups in society have, whether it's racial disparities in the way crimes are prosecuted, in the way those populations have access to all the different tools in our criminal justice system, from access to lawyers, to access to bail, to access to, just avoiding being targeted by police in the first place. New York's stop and frisk has been widely acknowledged to have had a very strong racial component to it. You didn't have white people stopped and frisked in New York City the way you did people of color. So, I mean, to say that that's not a part of the conversation, though it certainly isn't the entirety of the conversation. I mean, you have to acknowledge that those structural issues have existed for a long time in this country, don't you?
No, I don't. I don't think so. And,
Yeah.
and I know that this is one of those areas that just causes a sharp debate. And there's people that would probably be listening to this and go, "Ken's an idiot. You can't even acknowledge that."
I'm certainly not calling you an idiot. I want to understand. I want to understand your point of view.
Let me tell you where I'm coming from. When we start with the position that we have a system that has systemic racism, then we're starting with any time a minority is arrested, we have to say, well, I'm can't follow the law because I've got to make up for this historic problem. And I would say, especially now, I mean, wherever you live.
Oh, you're frozen, Ken.
What I was saying is, the point I want to make is, in our large urban area, where I think most of these issues are coming from, I think the police departments are majority minority. I think the prosecution departments are majority minority. And so you've got people who are out in the field, you've got people who are prosecuting the cases. And I just do not believe that if a Black person arrested somebody who was brown and a Black prosecutor prosecuted, I don't believe that's systemic racism. I think you should have to look at each individual. You know where I think the problem comes from? We no longer have faith in the system. And we don't have faith in the system because in one county you're a criminal and another you're not.
I mean, I understand the point about needing to look at each individual in the criminal justice system individually, and the temptation to see any individual who is a person of color as being a victim of structural racism in our system, or structural inequalities in our system that disadvantage people of color or people of lower socioeconomic status. But I mean, I have read studies that show that the rates of bail, since we are inevitably and understandably dipping in and out of the specific issue of bail, because it's part of the broader issue of criminal justice, and what needs to be done to make to allow us all to have greater faith in the system, which is fundamental and so important. But I've read studies that show that, for example, the rates of bail are higher when bail is set on people of color compared to, say, white people for the same crime. Is that an issue that you're familiar with?
Well, the issue that yes, I am familiar with that issue. And, for a while, for 5 to 10 years, we've had groups propose using risk assessment so that we can take the human element out and we can just set bail on an algorithm of risk. And those are out of favor now. I know Texas legislature is looking at that, but, California rejected it. I think Texas will reject it. The studies have come out rejecting it. And, one of the reasons why is because New Jersey's used that, and the racial makeup of their jail did not change. Now, maybe their jail population went down a little bit for a while, but their racial makeup of their jail did not change. Now, I would argue that that's evidence that this is a bigger issue. This is not just an issue of racism. If we go to an algorithm and just use that for a while and the racial makeup doesn't change, we've got bigger issues here than just saying, hey, we're just over incarcerating one demographic.
No, but what about the issue of the rates of bail being set higher for people of color than for whites? How does that issue get addressed? How do we?
But, you
how do
know,
we address that
in some counties, just because if you're homeless, you're not entitled to, you would not historically have been entitled to a PR bond because you're not stable. You
And
don't
what
have
is
a
what is
place to
PR?
live. So your bail would be higher, and that would be contrary. I mean, but then at the same time, what's the purpose of bail? Getting you to show up for court. If you're homeless, what is the likelihood of you showing up for court? Lower. And so I think when you look at certain racial groups and you're looking at it from a historical model where you're saying, look at these factors for setting bail. And one of them is, I mean, if you're trying to evaluate someone's stability, having a family would make you more stable. Having a home would make you more stable. And I think that in our inner cities, we have a disproportionate number of people of a racial group that does not fall, that is not accurate for, because we have failed them so many times already. We have to find ways to evaluate those groups in a better circumstance, because even the algorithms on the low end, they're over predicting that dangerous people are not dangerous and they should be released at no risk. And then at the higher end, we're holding people of certain races as dangerous when they're not. And, you know, those are problems, but who's the best to evaluate that? I mean, I think an algorithm is not the best person to evaluate that. I think that's the judge who sits and looks at people every day. I mean, the best evaluation tool for me is, what's your criminal history? I mean, the problem in Harris County is no one ever sees a magistrate for a certain crime. And you just get a $100 PR bond no matter how many times you get arrested for it. If we have a gatekeeper that looks at your criminal history, that's the best, and looks at you and can talk to you, that's the best barometer of whether you should be released. And remember, the release is just to get you to come to court. If you're not going to come to court, then you should be held in jail. But we have some places in Texas and some places in the country right now where they disagree. Even if you don't show up, they're not going to hold you accountable. They're still not going to put you in jail. And that's what's causing some of the chaos that we're seeing.
And what you've mentioned this a few times, so just so people know, what is a PR bond?
A PR bond is, we call it a personal recognizance bond. You see it in different ways. It could be have a face amount on it, so it could be $100, but you're not paying $100. Sometimes you're just signing your name. It's a free bond. In New York, they tried something instead of a PR bond. They just, for certain crimes, they released them without bond. Same effect, same result. In New York, the result was so bad, the crime increased. They repealed a lot of the changes and reforms, even during the middle of the pandemic. And so here's what I like to say. We want to set up a system that does not take advantage of the poor. But in doing so, we cannot set up a system that allows criminals to take advantage of the criminal justice system. That's what we're saying. We're setting up systems that have gone so far to an extreme that the court's hands are tied and they can't hold anybody accountable in some situations. And that's what's causing the chaos. And that's what we need to fight.
I think that's a fair point. And I think your perspective is valuable. I think I value it and I appreciate you sharing it with us. These are huge problems. I don't know that I agree that someone advocating for reforms that would try to address these issues in a way different than what you've been suggesting is trying to create chaos. I think if you at least are willing to ascribe good intentions to people, even where there are political differences, even very strong political differences, we're all looking to have a system that works in a way that doesn't treat people differently for the wrong reasons. If you committed a crime, it shouldn't matter whether your skin color is one thing versus something else. It shouldn't matter whether you have more money or less money. Our system should be colorblind. We have the statue of justice being blind for a reason, but we got to live up to that. And one way or another, we have to figure our way through these issues.
Here's one of the ways I like to say it. I agree with everything you said, especially for first-time offenders. But
Yeah.
once you're on bond and you fail to show up for court, or once you have multiple criminal history, you have a multiple criminal history, then you're not in jail because you're poor. You're in jail because your risk of failing to appear, your risk of offending again, and the risk to the public safety has increased. And so it's now not a question of whether you can afford it. It's a question of your risk. And I think in that situation, that's where we're having the problem. We're saying, oh, they can afford it, we got to let them out. No, their criminal history is what created this risk they have, and it's no longer about poverty.
Well, and it does seem too, from what you're saying, that one answer is, once you're in the system and now bail becomes part of the discussion, your options may not be as many. You have to deal with that. So it does seem like part of the issue to try to make the criminal justice system work more efficiently does have to take place several steps before you even get to the question of bail. Has to get to which crimes are we going to regard as crimes that need to be prosecuted. We only have so many prosecutors. We only have so many resources. We only have so many spaces in jails and prisons. You just can't.
Well, look at Texas. We have people moving to Texas left and right. We have no discussion about opening or building new jails. We only have discussions about closing existing jails on the state level. And, we've got more people coming to town. We've got more people that are going to be committing crimes, but we're not going to be setting up a system that can address them. So I agree with you. We only have so many places, so many seats at the table of prison.
Well, and we're already the most incarcerated population on the planet. I can't imagine there's too many people who, maybe other than the private prison industry, that wants to see more prisons built. There's no other country on earth that incarcerates more of its population than our country does.
I really like to look at our society through the viewpoint of history. Because if you look at it through history, you could say we've been through a time similar to this in the 60s, where we had a similar reaction and similar push for criminal justice reform. And as a result, I would say maybe a backlash, maybe a reaction to it, an overreaction, or maybe as a result of crime increasing. That's what brought in the era of law and order, people getting elected, and punishment being increased by statute, and then what brought us the war on crime. So, I tell the judges in Harris County, or I've asked them to consider, they're at the center of reform because they've agreed to it under a settlement of a federal case. They've even changed Texas. And if they're not careful, if they decide, well, we're not going to hold anybody accountable, if no matter how many times they don't show up, then they're going to be the reason why we're going to have the opposite reaction. But if they take these reforms that they've used and used them and then evaluate them, gave everybody their chance, and then if they screwed up, held them accountable to that, that could be the model for changes across the state, across the country. But the problem we have is the opposite. We're setting up reforms, we're almost tying the hands of the judge to make it very difficult to hold anybody accountable. And as we have less accountability, crime increases. That's going to cause a backlash. That's going to cause voters to say, we can't trust you with our protection. And so you're going to have what we've had in the history, what we've had historically. We're going to have more law and order people elected. And so it's almost in the hands of the left. They're the ones that could keep that from happening. But failing to hold people accountable is going to push us to a bigger reaction to the right eventually, if they're not careful.
Well, now we're really deep into an analysis of history and what are the trends and what are the, what is it that's really behind these political movements. I've always thought that the law and order ideology, including the, going way back to the days of Ronald Reagan when the war on drugs began, and I was working in Washington at the time, I remember it very well. I've always thought the law and order ideology had a racial component to it. I mean, they weren't talking about, locking up white people. It was, this is a reaction to, I think the law and order movement was a racial movement. It was a reaction itself to the civil rights era, and people of color getting more equality under the law in our country, and it was effective. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. There are more people of color incarcerated today, than ever before. And I mean, that's just not a secret. It's not a debatable fact. There are more people prosecuted who are people of color for crimes that white people aren't prosecuted for. I mean, there's studies showing bail rates are higher for people of color. Civil asset forfeiture is a problem for people of color and poor people. I mean, you just go up and down the
But look at all these topics, all the topics that we've talked about. We've talked about so many different areas. It's kind of, you can see multiple times the bail industry just caught in the middle.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not pushing anything. We're not trying to do anything. We're just trying to do what we've done for over 200 years. Someone gets arrested, they need to be monitored, they need to be gotten to court, they hire us, and we do our job.
Yeah.
With this cultural revolution, which we sometimes are the poster children for, we're caught in the middle. We're caught in the two extremes from the different sides, law and order people, and let's let everybody go. Let's don't have any accountability people. And I don't mean to oversimplify the left versus the right, but in all those different debates and all the things we've talked about, we're caught in the middle. We're not driving anything.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a fair point. I mean, you whatever the rules are, and those rules are set, as we've talked about now, they may be set by society, they may be set by Congress, they may be set by judges, prosecutors, they're not set by the insurance industry. You're just trying to follow those rules, whatever they are. So I think we do have to look at what those rules are and how those policies get set, and when those rules come into play in the life cycle of a criminal case and a criminal defendant's experience in the criminal justice system. But yeah, I think you're making a very fair point about that.
Probably one thing I would say is, the bail industry, under following the rules that have been set by the legislature, has made substantial investments across the state of Texas to place security with counties to say we will do our job, and we are penalized if we don't do our job. And so we're we get caught in the middle. But you look at all these push for reforms, and some of them are just not sustainable. Like Harris County, where we're releasing people without ever seeing a magistrate, and crimes going up, and we all agree crimes going up, but they just won't agree that it's because of the reform. New York agreed it was because of the reform, but Harris County won't. They just say it's something else. But here's my point is, when we have all these when we have this push for change and it creates chaos, it's not sustainable. It will not last, and it will either be pulled back or you'll have a reaction. That's not good for the industry. That's not good for criminal justice. We need to have a system in place where we all have faith in it. Where we are elected officials, instead of, I'm going to give you a really extreme example, the Chauvin trial that we just had. How many elected officials did we say, this guy is guilty, this guy has to be found guilty? And just 10 years ago, how many of those same elected officials would have said, we have a process, we have faith in the system, we must allow the system to do its job? We're now at the point where we don't even have faith in the system. We have to push it. We have to threaten it. We have to nudge it to do. And if you listen to the evidence, I mean, we can debate about whether that was the best location to have the trial. But I mean, the evidence was pretty daunting. I mean, the state put on a very strong case. So why are we having to have all these elected officials come out and say, trying to taint the jury pool, which is what we would have said 10 years ago, you cannot do this. This taints the pool. And we've got one elected official that did it, and they're thinking that could require a new trial. And so just because of those kind of statements, why are we now in a situation where that happens? We need to build trust. That should be our job as elected officials, or if I was an elected official, It should be your job as an elected official to encourage faith in the system. And when faith is taken away, where it's disproven, then you have to rebuild trust in the system. We're not doing that. We're tearing trust away, and we're confirming that you can't trust the system. And we're telling everybody that the system's crooked, and we're not doing anything to try to replace it. We're just being community agitators now, and we've got to overcome that.
Well, you're raising another big topic, and I agree that's an extremely important topic. We probably need to book another hour to get fully into that, Ken. But I mean, I would say that, probably the reason people invested so much in the outcome of that trial, and, given the evidence, given what we all saw in the video, given just how clear that case was, and it was a jury, a diverse jury of men and women, of whites and blacks, in that Minneapolis courtroom that unanimously found Chauvin guilty. Why should anybody have been on the edge of their seat, worried that it would turn out any different? Well, not for no reason, but because of decades of cases just like that, with evidence just as strong, including video evidence, resulting in an acquittal. I mean, I think that's why.
And how much
why
trust
did those cases end in acquittal?
And how
why
much
did those cops not get prosecuted? Why are there cops that have? I mean, I'm involved in a case right now where the prosecutor has completely distorted and twisted evidence to avoid the prosecution of a police officer. That kind of thing happens every day in the criminal justice system in this country. And when it happens day after day, year after year, decade after decade, you can see how people would build up a tremendous anxiety over the outcome of one particularly egregious case.
But here's my point. 2 years from now,
I'm not saying it's a good thing, by the way. I agree with your fundamental point that we ought to have. It would be great to have faith in our criminal justice system, so that we trust the judge and the jury to find the facts and apply the law, and do so impartially, without regard to race, without regard to socioeconomic status. I think that's the ideal we should all be working for. But we have not had that experience in this country for 200 years. And that's why there's this tremendous anxiety. That's why people have taken.
How are we going to build up trust, though? 2 years from now, we're at the Court of Appeals on the Chauvin case. The Chauvin and the Court of Appeals, heaven forbid this happen, rules that because of the comments of several of the elected officials, we're ordering a new trial. Now, everything, I mean, do you think the people that were in favor of the conviction are going to believe that are going to lose faith in the criminal justice system if that happens? I do. I believe the people that we built up trust with from the guilty verdict will now lose faith again. And it was unnecessary. It was completely unnecessary. You saw the case that was put on by the prosecutors. Everybody saw the case that was put on by the prosecutors. Why did we need a parade of elected officials saying what they said, and that under the rules could create a grounds for appeal? One of the judge said one of the comments could serve as a basis for ordering a new trial. And that would be, I mean, the cost to the county, the cost to the state, the cost to public safety, the cost to the reaction, the cost to the trust in the criminal justice system will be enormous. And it was silly. Should have never been done.
Well, I mean, look, I don't think there was any comment that would constitute reversible, a grounds for reversing the conviction. I don't think you can keep everybody's mouth sealed shut. I don't know that, I know I saw some dispute or debate about President Biden's comments. He didn't make any comment until after the jury was already sequestered and was deliberating. Others didn't show such restraint. It's true, but I mean, I've tried cases for 25 years. You can't really stop even jurors from reading the newspaper. They're not supposed to, but they take a solemn oath to disregard what they might hear or read, or whether it's in a newspaper, on TV, or on the internet. I mean, I do have fundamental faith in the jury system in that regard. I've seen lots and lots of people selected for jury duty. The moment their name is called, that they've been picked for the jury, many of them will shrug their shoulders or kind of breathe out a groan. But by the time the case gets to deliberations at the end of the trial, those jurors are locked into their role. They take it seriously. They understand the importance of their obligation. And I would say far more times than not, overwhelmingly, I've seen jurors take that obligation as seriously as they should. And I'm not saying that because they always agree with me. I'm saying I see them take their role and responsibility real seriously. And I don't think anything that some member of Congress or other elected official said being able to be demonstrated as having any improper effect on that jury.
But, if we just bring this situation back to, our bail topic, the jury was able to deliberate on this case because we as a bail industry did our job. We got the defendant to court every day. And, his bail was set very high, although I don't think he was at a risk for running or really at a risk of failing to appear, but he had a high profile case. And he was bonded out, and the bail industry did its job to get him to appear. And at the end of the day, the jury was able to deliberate because the private industry bail system did its job.
Right. Well, and his bail should have been set high because he was charged with homicide. But no, that's a fair point and a good place for us to end today. Ken, thank you. I've really enjoyed going toe to toe with you and really made some fair points. And I think this is a topic actually on this program I'm going to want to revisit again, because I think it may get into the middle of the process of our criminal justice system, as you were saying, but it is an important part of it. And I want to thank you. Appreciate you being here and sharing what you know about this and your views on this. And I always like a wide-ranging conversation because
I like having conversations with smart
works.
people. I think that when we have conversations with smart people, we come up with a great discourse, and we don't have to devolve into calling each other names, and we just have an intelligent conversation. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much.
I did too. Thank you, Ken.